my name's Akmal and I represent the Economics and Finance Society at the University of Canterbury. With me here is Kevin Blake, he's my External Relations Officer. He's been helping me to put this event together at the university. What we're here for is to welcome Nick Cater. He's the senior editor of The Australian. It's one of the renowned papers in Australia. And he's here to talk about his newest book, The Lucky Culture. And he's been brought down in New Zealand by the New Zealand Initiative and Dr. Oliver Hartwich. He's here with us, joining us today, and it's through their efforts that we have Nick here in New Zealand and in Christchurch, so we're ever so thankful to you. Thank you very much. So I would like to tell you, we'll be taking Q&As at the end of this event, and they will be also dealt by Oliver, and I hope you enjoy Nick Cater's talk. Thank you very much for turning up, and I hope we'll see you around. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Oliver Hartwich. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the University of Canterbury and to the Economics and Finance Society, and in particular also to Dr. Eric Crampton, who made this event possible. We are glad to have Nick Cater with us, Senior Editor at The Australian and the author of The Lucky Culture. Not The Lucky Country, that was a few decades ago, but a lot of people will probably know that Australia was referred to as the lucky country, but it's also a lucky culture because it's a culture built on egalitarianism, a country where people were free to make their own choices, where they could progress in life and where there was no snobbery or pretension of class, where there was an egalitarianism of manners and where you were pretty much the master of your own fate. And you were not allowed to look down on your fellow Australians because there was a concept called mateship. There was the idea that this was a grand experiment, this Australia, and I think to quite a large degree this is true for New Zealand as well. Grand experiment in science and progress and enlightenment, but unfortunately, as Nick argues in his book, this is all under threat. It's under threat by what he says is a new class, a new tertiary-educated class. We brought Nick over to New Zealand because we think that some of the issues that he talks about in the book directly apply to other developed countries as well, directly apply to New Zealand. Although, if the threat is a tertiary-educated class taking over the country, perhaps the threat is less pronounced in New Zealand since we export a large part of our tertiary-educated class to Australia. And maybe that's the problem for Australia. Nick is, of course, acutely aware of classless and class societies because he is British by birth and escaped Britain in the late 1980s to Australia, particularly I think because he was looking for an egalitarian society, a society that was quite different from his home country. And it is that feeling, this notion that something is changing, that something in Australia might become perhaps a little bit more British, that has triggered him to write this book. We think it's an important contribution to the debate, not just in Australia, but it should be heard here as well, and that's why we invited him. We're very grateful that he's made it across the Tasman to be with us tonight. Nick is one of Australia's most senior journalists, the best-known journalists, and been with a number of papers since moving to Australia. Worked in Canberra, in Adelaide, in Sydney, also for a time as a foreign correspondent in Asia. And he's been with the Australian newspaper since 2004 and is a senior opinion editor at the paper. This is his first contribution to the Australian egalitarianism debate, but we had lots of conversations over the past few days. I'm sure there will be more, so we look forward to hearing from him tonight. So without further ado, I hand you over to Nick Cater.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, so this is a book that after 20 odd years in Australia I decided to sit down and put down on paper what I thought about the place. Really partly to clarify my own thoughts because it seemed to me when I started writing this in 2010 that Australia had moved from where it was when I arrived in 1989. That it was much more, in a way, polarised place in terms of the public debate. But not along the lines that I remembered. It wasn't left versus right. It wasn't even quite city versus country. It was something quite new. And the arguments were fierce. I mean, the first part of the 20th century was a very difficult time in many ways. We had the climate change raised itself as an issue which was very, very divisive, particularly in Australia, I think, and the whole issue of the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, polarised people. But we had these huge arguments with people who've been friends for a long time, and I couldn't so I thought I'd sit down and write the book. It's been, came out in May, and it's really in two halves, I suppose. It is about the lucky culture, which is really my sort of homage to Australia, what makes Australia work. But by extension, what makes New Zealand work, because it seems to be because you guys made a big mistake in 1901 in not joining Federation, because, you know, fundamentally, you are very much Australian in your way of thinking, perhaps Australasian, we should call it, in terms of the issues that I talk about here, egalitarianism. Second part is the rise of the ruling class, and that's the new bit, and that's what leads to this tension that I've been talking about. That's where the fracture in the debate is, I see it, really between a divide on one hand you can call progressive, which is the zeitgeist of the intellectuals, and on the other hand, social conservatism, which is the way generally the broader population thinks and lives its life. It's been remarkably successful, this book, much more successful than I imagined. It's got a lot of interest in Australia, I think, because some of the ideas are quite different and provocative. And, my publisher said it's a barbecue stopper. And I said, well, it seems to me it's either a barbecue stopper or a barbecue lighter. So I bet you are, but I was very lucky to have a series of launches. It's been probably the best launched book in Australian history. We've had about a dozen launches around the country. The first one was John Howard, the former Prime Minister. And then, because I was very keen that it shouldn't be seen as a political book on necessarily favouring one side of the political fence or the other, because it was about culture, the second launch was with Chris Bowen, who was then languishing on the backbench, but in the recent reshuffle has become the treasurer, and he launched it at the Reevesby Workers' Club, which is a famous Labour venue, which actually, if you have been to that part of Sydney, has a hammer and sickle on the wall, so that's how Labour it is. A series of other launches, I won't go through them all, but finishing up last Friday with Kevin Rudd, who launched it in Brisbane. He had much to say about the book, very little that was complimentary, but there was, I can say, you know, if any of you have seen the book out there and tempted to buy it, there was bipartisan agreement between Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott, who reviewed the book for Spectator. On one point, they both agree it's a very readable book. So, and also I saw Kevin Rudd's copy, and it seemed well read, but in fairly good condition, which made me feel that I'd achieved my aim, which was that people didn't have to agree with it, but I didn't want anybody throwing it against the wall. So we got that far. When it had the substance of the book. When I launched it in Sydney with John Howard, I said a few words after he spoke, and I reminded him of an incident that happened when he was Prime Minister, which goes to the very heart of what I think Australia is about, and by extension New Zealand. He was leaving Kirribilli House one evening with his wife to go to a function in the official motorcade. I say motorcade, it's just two cars, it's not very grand, nor is his house. And as he came out into Kirribilli Avenue, there's cars parked on both sides in that road, and there's only one lane down it, and he found himself stuck behind a cyclist. Any other country in the world except New Zealand, I think there would have been mayhem. You know, the police motorcycles would have been out, possibly guns, helicopters. Get off the road, buddy, get off the road. But no, it's Australia, and not even the Prime Minister can pull rank over a cyclist on his way to the bottle shop at 6 o'clock at night. I then confessed to the Prime Minister that I was that cyclist. And that the Prime Minister hadn't been able to overtake me, even when I looked over my shoulder, saw he wasn't slowed down. But I told him it was nothing personal at all. In fact, I had the pleasure of slowing down Julia Gillard quite recently in the same manner. It was just me as a bomb, revelling in that egalitarian moment. It was just absolutely fascinating to me that in Australia nobody can pull rank, not even the Prime Minister. This is the essence of Australia, I think. It's its main operating principle. And I think you share it here too in New Zealand. Tonight I thought I'd just make one plea, and that is that if words are the foot soldiers of ideas, then the Anzac spirit demands that we must rescue the word egalitarianism from captivity. It's been left languishing, prisoner of the left for far too long. The true character of this liberating word has been disfigured, I think, since it was pressed into service by Western progressives who see it as a synonym for achieving equality of wealth. Yet in my understanding, egalitarianism as we once understood it was much more than that. It was much more inspiring than just simply dividing up the spoils. It wasn't equality of wealth, it was equality of status. It was the abolition of social privilege and the rejection of inherited class, and it oils the wheels of social mobility. It's not a static measure, you see, it's a dynamic force. It's the motive power of progress. Because if Jack believes he's as good as his master, then he believes that there's nothing to stop him from becoming master, at least master of his own destiny if he applies himself to the task. In here then we see the founding principle, I think, of European settlement in Australasia, where immigrants aspired to a better world, better than the old one. They would adopt Great Britain's institutions, but they would reject its neuroses. They'd reject outright its fixation with class. In Australia we speak of a fair go, and I don't know whether that's common in New Zealand lingo, but I suspect it is. In some parts of Australia they used to call it the open go, but it amounts to the same thing. It's a precious right that's highly valued by generation after generation of migrants. But it also comes with a responsibility, I argue, one that was acutely felt in a pioneering society. Because a new nation doesn't just build itself, of course, and there's no place for loafers, which I understand that I read this morning was actually a New Zealand word, which has crept into the broader vocabulary of the English-speaking world. With the right to a fair go comes the obligation to have a go. And it's produced a citizens that have searched for opportunities and the chance to improve their lives of themselves and their families through the application of hard work. In New Zealand, I think much of the energy in those early days has sometimes been attributed to Calvinism. The Presbyterians largely came from Scotland, with that strand of Christian thought which requires people to work out their own salvation here on earth. But you don't have to be a Protestant, I think, to get the work ethic in this part of the world. You just have to be a migrant, because it's the first duty of every migrant starting a new life to prove to himself and his family and those people at home why he's given up this old life for a new one. I experienced that very strongly at the age of 31 when I arrived in Sydney Airport with two children, aged 1 and 3, and a wife, without a job, unemployed and homeless in a country that I'd effectively just bought off the plan. It was a very exciting moment. I remember the exhilaration of being there in Sydney after all the planning, but also a moment of terror, because you suddenly realise that you have to make a go of it. There's no going back and saying it didn't work. You have to prove this is the better country you told people it was, even if you had to turn it into a better country yourself. So the egalitarian promise, well, thanks to the egalitarian promise, of course, we get every opportunity to do it, because unlike the country we leave, the playing field is relatively level. The old and new Australians are afforded equal respect. And for those of us who grew up in the British class system, this is a tremendously fresh breeze you feel when you get here. The customs immigration officers demand respect, not because they've got uniforms on, but just because they're doing a job, like you. You sit next to the taxi driver, of course. There's no recourse to status in Australia, and there's the promise, which is repeated so often that it ought to be a cliche. In this country, everybody has a fair go. What happens next, for better or worse, is completely up to you. Egalitarianism, I argue, grants us the license to make our own luck. With this comes this respect for honest manual labour. and the disrespect for those who avoid work. Because in a modern nation, as I argued before, if you're building it from scratch, your reputation comes from what you do rather than from what you are. The obligation to work is tied closely to this idea of mateship, because if one person doesn't pull their weight, the others have to work harder. In New Zealand, I read an account from an early book which mentioned this idea of the sundowner. They were the men who turned up at the sheep station at the end of the day when the work was done, just for a meal and a bunk for the night. This was considered completely a completely disreputable thing to do. In Australia, we coined the word bludger, which is a bludger was originally a term used for a man who lived off the immoral earnings of a woman, entirely disreputable human being, and it became to mean anybody who just didn't let other people do the work. There's an early colonial novelist called Kenaway, I don't know if you've come across him, but he spoke of, in New Zealand, how the humblest labourer who earns his bread by the sweat of his brow is held in higher honour than the haughtiest of fine gentlemen who spend their dronish existence doing nothing. And in that early literature from the 19th century, particularly from New Zealand, I notice, you continually get this theme of the upper crust gentleman who comes out thinking he can lord it over everybody else and ends up with nothing to do because he hasn't have any practical skills. Egalitarianism's political outcome, of course, is democracy, and this is what Alex de Tocqueville went to study in America in the early 19th century, where he noticed that the hope of personal improvement flourished with the disappearance of class structure. As a system of government, democracy at that stage was considered deeply suspicious by the European intellectuals because they thought it would fall back to some kind of mediocrity, that the enfranchisement of the foolish and the unworthy, they believed, was a dangerous thing and it would lead to a popular, vulgar country. Yes, de Tocqueville noticed they were right in part of that. What he noticed was that there was, though, at that stage, very little attention to the higher things, the life of the mind in America. They were much more concerned with making money and doing the practical things. But Tocqueville, unlike his European contemporaries, argued that that's just a temporary phase. It's not the eventual outcome of democracy. And that once people have got the basic things in life and start to achieve additional wealth, then the culture naturally follows. That book came out in 1840, as you probably know. And I think the progress of America in the 20th century has proved him right. You know, the wealth of culture that came out of the States during that period, which we still thrive on and enjoy, not just the popular culture of the movies, the television shows, but in all the fields of art, in drama, in music, even in opera. America has contributed more than its fair share in the last century. I think so. There are obviously some clear differences, I think, between the egalitarianism as we understand it here and egalitarianism such as it exists in America. And it's a ripe area for exploring. We were discussing it last night. I'd like to look at this further. It seems to me, for instance, the question of mateship is not quite the same in America. You know, the word buddy doesn't quite say the same as mate to me. And we could look at this a lot more. In my book, I go back to look at the historical differences between the two in the way the two countries were founded. And in this, I think, I discover a clear sense of why Australians felt they were masters of their own destiny when they came here. When the Pilgrim Fathers settled in Massachusetts in 1620, it was before the Enlightenment. They were there by divine providence. When the first fleet, however, landed in Sydney Cove, it was the era of the Enlightenment. It was the era of man's power of reason. Man was the master of his own destiny at last. It couldn't be by the gift of God or the hand of fate that Australia would be built. Australia was built with human ingenuity and human labour. But when the Pilgrim Fathers sighted Cape Cod after a turbulent 66-day voyage across the Atlantic, the first thing they did was to cite Psalm 100. Know that the Lord is thy God. It is he who has made us. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Their tribulations were only just beginning, of course, because I argue that the east coast of America, rather than the east coast of Australia, was the real fatal shore. By March 1621, 4 cold months after they'd arrived, half of the pilgrims were dead from disease. They'd arrived too late for the growing season and had very thin soils which they couldn't cope with. They only had a very primitive knowledge of agriculture. It was before the great breakthroughs in scientific agriculture at the start of the 18th century. They scratched around in the dirt for quite some while until an Indian showed them a little trick. You get some dried fish and sprinkle that down, and somehow they managed to get some sort of a crop together. And after a year in this so-called Puritans' utopia, place of disease, starvation, suffering, death, nonetheless, they hold a Thanksgiving ceremony to give thanks to God. For what? I don't know. There were no recorded readings from the Bible when the first fleet landed Sydney Cove. In fact, it's Saturday. The following day, the chaplain they brought along with them suggested they might have a church service, but no, they're too busy. They've got rock to hew, they've got trees to cut, so it's 8 days before the first church service takes place. In fact, it's 5 years before they even build the first wattle and daub church, and by that time they've already built the first scientific institution, the observatory, and the first brewery, of course. They came to with this working knowledge of agricultural science. It could have been a bit better organised, they could have had more people along those lines, and they did struggle for a year or two with starvation, with the threat of starvation at least, with no fresh supplies landing, struggling to know what to do with the soil. And then they found a man, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Robert Hughes' book, The Fatal Shore, which is a book about that convict period, which is a smashing read, but it's all about cruelty and hardship. And there are a few tales of redemption in there. And one story that he misses out, which is, I think, for me, the most illuminating story of all the convicts, is the story of James Roos. He was a housebreaker from Cornwall. He was also a farmer, and he'd been sentenced to hang for breaking into a neighbour's house, but was reprieved and sent to Australia. After about a year and a half, they looked around for anybody who knew anything about farming, and they found James Roos, and they said, well, we'll give you an acre and a half of land and see what you can do with it. Now, he brought with him the knowledge of agriculture that had come from that early part of the 18th century. He knew how to put organic matter in the soil. He only had leaves and gum leaves, but it helped. He knew he had to add potash, so he could burn wood in there. He knew how to add nitrogen to the soil. And within 18 months, he was self-sufficient. This was a great breakthrough, that here was a country where you could survive, where man by ingenuity and ingenuity alone, not by the hand of God, could make this place work. And this wonderful story of redemption, that it didn't matter who you were, where you came from, providing you could make it work, that was fine. I think Australians, in telling their history, have given the Australians of the 19th century have given them a great disservice by refusing to recognise the great innovation and progress that occurred then. Probably because I think it was in the agricultural sphere, it was not valued as much as in other spheres of industry. We often talk about how we rode on the sheep's back as if this was somehow just an accidental thing, we were just lucky. But in fact, the sheep, when we first brought it out to Australia as a working sheep in 1820 from South Africa, was a very scrawny beast indeed. You'd get 1.1 kilos of very rough, coarse wool off it if you were lucky. That was a wool that was only really suitable for blankets or army uniforms. But the Australian pastoralists, bit by bit, said about crossbreeding the sheep, And in 1860, George Pepin came up with his great super sheep, the Pepin Merino, which became the father of just about every breed of sheep after that point. And by the end of the century, by 1890, you were able to get 5 kilos or more of wool off one sheep. Not just any old wool, but fine wool that was in high demand from the best tailors in Europe who queue up to buy it according to the property it came from, like a French wine. This was an achievement of tinkering, if you like, of people making their own luck. We've invented the mechanical shears, an Australian invention. George Woolsey came up with those. It took him 20 years of trial and error, but eventually came up with a machine that was so efficient that farmers could install these things and recoup the cost in 1.5 seasons. It managed to get 6 ounces more off each sheep. They could be shorn more quickly. You could use less skilled labour. So at every stage of the game, they're improving it. We're improving the soil. I'm not comfortable with this general belief that all man has done in Australia and New Zealand is degrade the soil. It seems to me that if we're not careful, we degrade the soil. But we have to build it up too, and we've improved the soil. The great broadacre farming of South Australia, West Australia, would not have been possible without the development of superphosphate. And then having got all this war with this desperate shortage of labour often being the great driver of innovation, we designed the world's first combine harvester, the sunshine harvester, designed by H.V. Mackay. And here's an indication of how we don't tell this story very well. Everybody in Australia, everybody who's been to school or studied history, knows of the sunshine, the harvester judgment, which was a judgment made by the High Court, which granted a fair wage to every worker, ensured the 8-hour day, and these great principles of working life. And it was based around the factory, the harvester factory in Sunshine, where this test case was taken. But nobody knows, or few people know, the story of the harvester itself, which was produced there in a factory that was, at that stage, in terms of mass production, was every bit as advanced as the Ford factory in Detroit, and became the most, it became the highest value producer of any manufacturing plant anywhere in the Commonwealth outside of Britain. But we don't celebrate that. It's part of the Australian story which somehow gets left behind. We tell the social angle to it, but not that side. What's driving Australia and New Zealand through that period is a belief in the spirit of progress. And if you look back through the newspapers and magazines at that time and books, this phrase, the spirit of progress, comes up time and time again. It's a great sort of belief arising out of the Enlightenment that scientific, industrial, technological progress combines and eventually gives you economic progress, and with that comes social progress. These types of progress are inseparable. In the late 1870s, the new technology of freezing comes along, which enables you to take meats from New Zealand and Australia and other far-flung parts of the world and take them to London in good condition. It's a massive breakthrough because there's starvation, there's poverty, there's malnutrition in London in the 1860s because there's a shortage of agricultural products, a shortage of protein. By the end of the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th century, thanks to this technology, the British diet has been revolutionised. Your average working person is eating 6 times more meat than he was 30 years ago, with a noticeable improvement in health. This has come about through a technological breakthrough, combined with entrepreneurs like Thomas More, the wool trader in Sydney, and also in New Zealand, which was also at the forefront of this, of course. Investment of business in industry. And there's a sense in the speeches at that time they give that they see this not just as a business opportunity, not just as a way to bring in export money, but as a way to improve the lot of all mankind. There's a wonderful speech where Thomas More talks about how this new technology will end famine. You'll no longer have a shortage in one country and a glut in another. Somehow this idea has disappeared through the 20th century. We're now less convinced that the types of progress go together. I'm jumping ahead of myself, I'll come to that bit in a minute. But nowadays we seem to believe that social progress can exist in its own, in a bubble, without scientific and technological industrial progress going with it. So throughout the 20th century you get this story of this spirit of progress driving on and on, increasingly with state involvement, and it comes out of the hands of the entrepreneurs who just tinkered around, and increasingly becomes this great nation-building idea that sweeps New Zealand and Australia. In Australia, culminating really after the Second World War, when there's a feeling that the country is desperately underpopulated and underdeveloped, and there needs to be this huge national effort to speed progress. But still the spirit of progress is strong, it's just being carried out in a different way. And you get the Snowy Mountain scheme in the alpine area of Sydney, of Australia, barely touched by human hands. And yet we're quite happy to go in and blow away half a mountain and build these massive man-made lakes without a whisper of protest. Nobody seems concerned of what's going on. Nobody seems concerned in 1960 when they complete the Warragamba Dam, 35 square miles of bushland to the west of Sydney that produces the dam that produces the water for Sydney. No protest whatsoever. We built the Kurnell oil refinery down there close to the airport near Botany Bay. No protest whatsoever. And then in the late 60s, the Tasmanians come up with a great scheme to build the Lake Pedder impoundment, which is a massive area of water about 7 or 8 times larger than Sydney Harbour, to feed the hydroelectric schemes. And at first it's bipartisan agreement both in Hobart and in Canberra. Canberra government agrees to fund this. The Labor opposition are quite happy with it too. But something turns in the next few years, something quite dramatic. So by 1972, when they're filling this dam with water, people start to get cold feet. Tommy Wren, Labor MP, stands up in Parliament in 1972 and says, look, I know we supported this program, I know we agreed to fund it, but something's changed. We realise we can't go on eating into the wilderness in this way. We have to stop. Judith Wright, the poet, flies to Hobart for a great protest about this dam as it's filling up. And the headline in the Hobart Mercury reads, "Stop progress or it will stop us." Suddenly, and it happens very quickly, I argue, almost like a Suddenly Buster coming up, the whole zeitgeist changes from the idea of progress to this idea of what we now think of probably as sustainability. The idea that science is not the answer to our problems, or not all of them at least. In fact, it can be the problem as much as more than the solution. It's a doubt in this story of modern science which has begun with the Enlightenment and continued apace ever since, but there's a nervousness creeps in. In the book I don't look at why this is, although it's a very interesting discussion to have. I mean, we could look, I suppose, at the two world wars, particularly the Second World War, where you see science and industry being used for quite diabolical purposes. Perhaps conclude that was the start of the loss of faith. It's a long debate. But anyway, for whatever reason, it creeps in. What I say did happen, and I'll go back to Donald Horne here just first before I move on to that. My title of my book, as Oliver pointed out, The Lucky Culture, is a deliberate play on Horne's book, The Lucky Country, which came out in 1964. It's a very good book. I read it a number of times in the writing of this book. For the most part, because it forms a very useful marker of where intellectual thought was at that time, because it's really a synthesis of what the general smart opinion was in Australia in that era. And where I break with Horne mightily is on this question of luck, because in Horne's view it's a lucky country with a complacent people riding upon that luck and a second-rate political class. I won't argue with you about the political class, but maybe we've got a third-rate one now. But the point about the luck I do argue with, because it seems to me that luck wasn't just a resource that we mined from the ground or we just plucked from the trees at all. It was something that we had to make of our own accord. The Dutch, sailed up and down the west coast of Australia quite frequently. It was one of their main routes to get there. They'd step ashore every now and then, but they never ever thought it was ever worth colonising. It just looked like too much like hard work. And I go back to that line in our national anthem, we have golden soil, but wealth for toil. The luck has to be created. It has to, whatever benefit, whatever prosperity has come out of Australia, it's come out of human ingenuity and human effort. But Horn in '64 looks around and he says, this is almost an anti-intellectual country. And you can see why he might have said that, because in '64, only 1.7% of the workforce had a university degree. And he argues with many people at that time that what Australia needed was an educated class. It needed a class of technocrats, if you like, people who could run government in a more scientific way, who could plan, who could organise society, and there's a big suggestion then too, in much of what people are saying, not so much in Horn but elsewhere, that we understand science very well. We can do scientific things very well. What we need is a sort of science of society. We need to be able to organise humans in a more systematic way. So for this reason, he calls for an educated class, but of course one is already in the making by '64, because from '57 onwards, Robert Menzies has started this massive program with expanding higher education, creating new greenfield universities on a huge industrial scale. The same is happening in the United States, where the impetus for the expansion of higher education, of course, comes with Sputnik, the realisation that the Russians are ahead in the space race and they have to catch up. They want rocket scientists, and so there's a massive increase in the universities there. It's been happening in Britain too, and in New Zealand on a smaller scale and less dramatically, but still, there's a doubling of the number of people in higher education between the early '60s and the mid '70s. So eventually we have an educated class, as Horn suggests. Now I think we have them in Australia in quite a large number. 25% of graduates are now, 25% of people in the workforce are now graduates, or now have at least a bachelor degree or higher. And it's the government's ambition, although it just recently broken from it, that there should be 40% by 2020. The same in New Zealand too, of course, a massive expansion of the graduate class. And I argue in the book that this cohort becomes almost like a class in itself. It becomes a group who think they know and understand the world in a better way or in a different way. And as time went on in Australia, and I don't know, I suspect this is happening too in New Zealand because it happens everywhere in the world, the graduate class becomes large and it tends to settle in an enclave. It settles in the inner cities largely. And if you look at the language around the world, we talk about inside the Beltway in Washington as defining a certain way of thinking. It's not actually where you live, it's the way you think. You're in the insiders. In Britain they talk about inside Zone 1, which is the tube zone. In France they talk about being inside the périphérique, which is the motorway which surrounds inner Paris. We don't have quite such a clear geographical marker in Australia, and of course it's across many cities, but it's certainly true that there are stark differences now, in the nature of the population between those inner city suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide to some extent, and Perth is a little more diverse, but you can still see these huge differences between suburbs. Even in Canberra, which you think is a pretty homogenous city, you can now see a stark difference in the nature of the population between that inner city bit and down in the south, which is much more entrepreneurial, private sector sort of people. What are the differences? Well, first of all, a high proportion of university graduates. In some cities, in some places like the seat of Melbourne, federal seat, which covers central Melbourne and Fitzroy and Carlton and some of those university suburbs, 48% of people have a university degree. The seat of Melbourne as well, the other striking thing is 36% of people in the census say they have no religion. Also in the seat of Melbourne, which is the only seat with a Green MP, 36% of people vote Green, coincidentally, although I think those two things are related. You then get a difference in marriage and the way people live with one another. So you'll find a much higher proportion, say, of people who live in de facto relationships compared to conventional marriages. In Sydney is 1 in 4 people live in a de facto relationship, but the national average is 1 in 10. The striking one in the city of Sydney, which of course covers Paddington and the gay Mardi Gras territory, is that 1 in 10 couples are same-sex couples. But if you get out to Campbelltown on the edge, which is sort of more a suburban, more typical sort of family area, it's 1 in 340. So stark differences in composition, and in so much as the census gives us a clue as to attitudes. It's not obviously an attitude survey, but I think in some of these measures we can see these different attitudes. You can see that people think quite differently, and of course we know they vote quite differently too. The Green vote is almost all confined to those areas. The great illustration of this in Australia was the Republican debate when we voted, whether we wanted a republic or not. Everybody that I worked to was convinced that there should be a republic. I didn't meet anybody who didn't think there should be. And our newspaper and the newspaper I worked for at the time campaigned heavily in favour of a republic. It was assumed, I think, by all of us, because we hadn't really done much in the way of detailed survey on who was voting for a republic or not. We assumed that all of us assumed that it would be the working class, the Catholics, who would vote for a republic and reject the Queen, and it would be the middle and upper classes, the toffs, if you like, who voted for the, got that wrong. It would be the working classes who went for the republic and the break with this aristocracy, this unearned privilege, and it would be the middle class and upper classes who supported the privilege, supported the Queen. In actual fact, it was completely the reverse, and the clearest factor that correlates, that predicts whether you voted Republican or whether you voted for the monarchy was education. The seats that had the highest Republican vote had the highest number of graduates, and they were places like Bradfield, which is a deeply conservative seat that has a high number of graduates. North Sydney, where I live, a high number of graduates, high Republican vote. Tony Abbott's seat of Werriwa, high Republican vote, high number of graduates. Ironic slightly, because at that stage Tony Abbott, of course, was driving the campaign for the monarchy. So I felt when I looked at this, I think that I can, with some empirical justification, say we now have two distinct classes who think in two separate ways. I've come about the argument that way today because I left that bit out yesterday when we were talking in Auckland, and I felt that there was some confusion or misunderstanding about who I meant when I spoke about this new upper class. But it is basically a class built around education, a class with educated values who consider they think in abstract terms. And it is a class which really forms around these ideas we call progressivism, which to me is not so much an ideology as a narrative. It's a way of thinking about the world. It's a way of thinking about the world that says once we were, in a dark, barbarous period, but we've gradually, through step by step, been able to improve and bring about more elements of civilization through various causes that we fought and won, from white Australia to gay rights, to all these things. Women's rights, of course, is a big one. These are stages along the way. We still haven't got there to this utopia. There are more causes to fight, and it's a continual process. This is the narrative which I challenge, and some people, including Kevin Rudd, find quite confronting. I mean, for Kevin Rudd, in his speech, the past wasn't dark enough in my account, and the present wasn't sunny enough. Because I think in the course of writing this book, I started started out, I think, with doubts about that progressive narrative, and it's really confirmed them going through the book, because I can no longer hold to the idea that these progressive causes are necessarily improving the world. Of course, some things, in some respects, there were some things that just straight out had to be done in my lifetime. Even I see, things like the acceptance of somebody's sexuality as being, well, in my view, something of no consequence whatsoever to any other aspect of their life. For some people, it's something to be celebrated and asserted. But whatever it is, it's obviously something that noticeably in my lifetime has come to be. We've moved on a great deal on that. And plainly in terms of women's rights as well. But with one caveat, it seems to me that much of the progress we talk about women's rights applies to middle class women, educated women, whereas I'm not sure that the life of other women has really progressed so strongly. One example of this I wrote a column about the other day was the issue of single mothers, which is really a category that didn't exist as such really in Australia or New Zealand in the middle of the last century. There'd always been about 5% of births that were considered illegitimate, and of course there was a tremendous social stigma attached to that. So either there'd be a shotgun wedding of some sort, or the baby would typically be adopted. But the idea of a single mother living on her own with a baby was completely unknown really until the second half of the last century. It wasn't recognised as something that the government should give welfare to support in New Zealand, in Australia in 1973, and New Zealand in 1975. In the Australian case, what's happened is we've gone from less than 10% of births being illegitimate or ex-nuptial births in 1972, 9.6% of births are in that category, to now 34%, more than a third of births. You'd like to think that all those were living, with kids living in de facto couples or happy single mum situations. Of course, we know many mothers or fathers indeed who raise children in that circumstance. But statistically, of course, that's just not so. The typical profile of a single mum, 66% will have welfare in Australia as their main source of income. 2/3 live in rental accommodation. In every respect, in every measure, they have the worst lives you could imagine, and the kids are brought up in this circumstance. So, when you go through the progressive projects one at a time, I think you find so many unintended consequences in so many respects in which there's been little empirical measure of what's been achieved. It's been felt that these are great symbolic things that should be achieved. When you examine them, sometimes you end up questioning them. So the book really does go to the heart of that progressive narrative, and that's where the friction is, and I expect some of you will probably struggle with that bit as well. But on the question of the class, I'm really picking up in Australia, I think, what has been written about more widely in America for some decades now, and in Britain too, that you can have a knowledge class as such, a knowledge class that services power through culture rather than wealth or power. That is plainly, I think, quite a strong factor in Australian public debate at the moment and needs to be recognised. Where I come to the point of saying that it's a threat to egalitarianism is perhaps the most contentious bit of all, because progressives typically will think they are the most egalitarian and fair-minded people in the world. But I argue that in having a slightly elitist view of the world, being, if you like, a meritocracy, considering that their opinions are worth more than ordinary people, that's where the clash comes. And that it's really an affront to democracy as I see it, where everybody gets one vote, everybody has an equal say in the public arena. So that's about the broad sweep of it. Might throw it open for questions.
Perhaps I could just ask the first question. If it's a ruling class, how do they rule us? What are the rules on?
Well, as publishers license ruling class, I don't actually think they do rule. I think they'd like to. But their influence influence comes through their disproportionate presence in the key cultural institutions. Universities will be one, teaching profession, but also, of course, in my profession in journalism, we were talking about this earlier. Just in a company like mine, I work for a newspaper which some would regard as a right-wing paper, I suppose, and yet, Oliver asked me to do a survey of the individuals in the building. What do I think you'd find? I think you'd find that, by and large, they were much more progressive end of the scale than the social conservative, and you'd probably find, regardless of voting intentions, they tend to vote more for Labour and the Greens than they would for the Liberal Party. And I suspect that's the same in any media organisation around the world, simply for the fact that the sort of people that go into the media are not financiers or businessmen. They're humanities graduates like myself, and who tend to share certain assumptions and prejudices.
You managed to leave them behind. You throw it open to questions. I'm pretty sure it's controversial enough to trigger lots of them. What's that first?
Hi. How can we expect people that have a high education to think that their opinion, or is to, I'm not phrasing this very correctly, if someone has a high education, how do we work around that they think that their opinion is worth more than someone that's just a labourer?
Well, it's a difficult one, because I think higher education, particularly the way it's structured now, encourages you to think that you're coming out smarter than the rest, because that's what you're investing your time and money for, isn't it? So you get ahead of the pack and make yourself more qualified. I have big problems, and I go greater length in the book about the nature of modern education. And those are, I think, largely concerns that I find that are shared by almost every academic I talk to. And they go to things like the quality of modern higher education, the idea that, inevitably once you expand the system, you expand it fairly fast, then it's hard to keep up the same standard of teaching or the same ratio of time between the students and so forth. We all know, of course, I'm sure it's the same here. I haven't spoken to people in New Zealand about it, but in Australia, of course, a lot of complaints from academics about the amount of red tape, paperwork that take up a lot of time these days, the amount of compliance and so forth, which take away from teaching. So I think it's sort of self-evident that the quality of education isn't as good. So I'm not sure that people are getting the product they think they're investing in for a start. My second point here is that I think intellectual or abstract thought always has to be tested against real-world experience. When I remember, the first lessons you get in mathematics is here's your answer. Is that what you expect? So you do the common sense test against the figure as your first check, really. And I think that's the same with all wisdom. I think in a way that the best result is when theoretical or abstract knowledge is tested or works with practical knowledge. I've spoken to guys in the mining industry now who complain, manual workers in the mining industry who complain about the new set of regulations that's always coming in. There's always a new regulation. It might be about a new type of ladder or how to install this or that. And their constant complaint is, well, these people don't know. If they'd worked in a mine, they wouldn't have advocated that type or that. And that's a clear example, I think, of increasingly what I see, which is the intellectuals working over here and imposing their will on the people that work with their hands. Whereas certainly during the settlement period, the pioneering period in Australia and New Zealand, you wouldn't have had that. People would have worked in much closer proximity. In Australia, the cocky and the shearer, as being here, were much equals, because of the shortage of labour and so forth. There was a lot more respect between the two of them. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that academics need to be more in the community, and people need to be prepared to test their beautiful theory against practice.
I actually think, in respect, that you have the question backwards, that it's not how can we convince people who have degrees that they're not as important as they think they are, but how can we pay attention to the others? Because the others assert themselves, because we didn't convince British aristocrats that they weren't as important as they thought they were in order to get egalitarianism going. You had other people sort of coming to the fore, and I think we're much more likely to succeed that way than by telling the people who currently have degrees that they're not that important.
I understand, but that's a human nature question I was asking. You know what I mean? In the psyche, it's human nature. If you're very good at something,
I totally,
to disrespect the other person.
I totally agree, but I think spotlight should probably be on the other people.
Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, you're saying, I'll just clarify this, the elites and the educated people are voting for Labour and the workers are voting for National as in this country. When do we, as a worker, when do I know when to swap?
Well, this is the great sort of turnaround in politics, not just here, but in the United States, you get the same thing.
I agree with you too.
Yeah, and it's much underreported or understood. If Gough Whitlam was elected, I looked at the exit polls for Gough Whitlam's 1969 election, and a very small percentage of professionals were voting for Gough Whitlam, it was like 20%. Of course now, it's almost the entire professional class votes for Labour. So there has been this great transformation, and it's come about because you had a great influx of educated people and intellectuals joining the Labour Party in Australia and being the Labour Party here. That was almost their party of choice, and some went obviously to the other side too, but the vast majority saw Labour as their natural home. And the tension in Australia, which I talk about, going to some length of the book, has always been there from the early mid-60s, where you start to get significant numbers of intellectuals attached to the Labour Party, which was very much an anti-intellectual party up to that point. The tensions are there right from that point, and that they're managed in different ways, sometimes better than others. But I think in this last government, what we've seen is really this has come to the fore in this absolute fracture. And as to the conversion aspect, and it is a conversion, I think we've seen this at state government level, that seats that have been Labour seats forever and a day have crossed over. And when they do cross over, it's not just a little bit, it's not just like one or two voters change their mind. As one party worker told me, it's like a mass conversion. It was a Billy Graham had been through, and it'll add along has gone on, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I've just pulled up some of our voter turnout data in front of us, because I remember the political commentary from the 2011 election was that we had our lowest voter turnout yet. And so we're talking about only 3/4 of those who are eligible. So you have the enfranchisement, the right to vote, but 1/4 of us in this country are so apathetic who don't vote. So in recorded history, 2011 was the year where we had the lowest voter turnout. So I'm fascinated with this kind of sense of, even though society as a whole has become more educated, more of us at the same time have become more apathetic about our participation in the political process. And my sense is that there are both push and pull factors in that, and I'd just be sort of interested in a comment on that.
I'm interested in, one of the phenomena of the last 15, 20 years has been the rise of a sort of political profession. It used to be something where you go to Parliament, you find people from all walks of life there. But now, more and more, the party takes over by professional politicians, and you sense that there is a deeper cynicism towards politics now than there once was, because politics are seen as remote. And I sense here that, with the proportional representation, that's accelerated too. But that's interesting what you say, and the same's true in Britain. The British Labour Party reckon they've lost 7 million votes since 1997. Some to the Tories, some to UKIP, but a lot of them just aren't voting anymore.
Yes, I would agree as a fellow on that in Britain, yes, absolutely, that cynicism to government and possibly being a different, seeing as a sort of collection of class. We all went to the same school.
Yeah, that's right.
But so I had a question, which is the membership of this class. If everybody is getting this higher education, is that finite, or do we all suddenly become a member of the class, and then do you have any workers left?
Well, I don't think it can be. range of options for people at tertiary level. So yeah, it can't go on forever. But it does go to that question of there was an expectation, I think, amongst the new progressives that eventually these ideas would be adopted by everybody, and that the old ideas of social conservatism were just sort of the old colonial stick in the mud. And then you saw, of course, since the big change in occupations, fewer people actually even physical manufacturing jobs and so forth. Fewer people actually employed more people employed in service workers. Fewer people as employees in Australia, more as contractors. And there was an expectation in the 90s within Labour that eventually the electorate would catch up with them. But it hasn't happened. It's much deeper than your occupation. It's an attitude, and it comes from your family and your upbringing. It's a cultural understanding, very much. What I'm talking about here is, we're always happy to talk about cultural diversity when it comes to, ethnic groups. But this is a clear case of cultural diversity, really, and people don't change that very easily.
Thanks, really interesting. I've got two questions, but I'll save the other one for later. I'll just go with one for now. There seems to be a bit of a tension within the elite class that you're talking about, and you're kind of lumping two aspects of it together in your talk, and I was wondering if you might distinguish between these a little bit. So on the one side, the progressive movement has been pushing towards allowing more individual choice over how to run their own lives in aspects such as sexuality and marriage and work and how to raise a family. And to my mind, that's entirely in keeping with the fundamental egalitarianism, where nobody knows better than you yourself how to make your own life decisions. But at the same time, there's the other kind of more nannying aspect to it, where they're saying, well, leaving all that aside, you don't know what's best for you in terms of smoking and drinking and other kinds of risky behaviors that you might like to enjoy, and so we're going to put some restrictions on you with respect to that, because we know better than you on that kind of a front. I tend to celebrate the first aspect and deplore the second. Do you see these as being sort of all part of the same kind of progressive movement?
Yeah, it's how it develops over time. I think in the 60s, you could generally make the case that people who were advocating these positions were they were indeed the outsiders. They were standing outside the establishment, arguing for freedom, and particularly around sex and sexual activity. I don't seem to be the one that obsessed them actually. More than anything, when they look back with these great heroic ideas of what they actually represented at the time, this was possibly the biggest issue, was free love and so forth. So yeah, they were outside them, but I think my argument is that they then become a sort of normative middle class, and then want to say, well, these are the values which everybody should follow, and first of all, they try through assimilative methods to try and bring people over to persuade them that these are a much better way to behave. And when that doesn't work, you get what we're seeing to increasingly now, which is coercive action to try and impose a particular moral code. You'd be familiar with this in the area you study, but it's similar. You trace a similar pattern through the United States through the late 19th, early 20th century towards alcohol prohibition. First of all, they start out by trying to persuade people that they'd be better off not to drink alcohol and be healthier, and they'd have more money for their family. When that doesn't work, we get the coercion and chemicals.
You mentioned the hammer and sickle of the Labour office. Perhaps it should be transferred to some other places, and it should be knowledge workers of the world unite. You've got not to lose much brains. The thing is, maybe it's not a knowledge class, maybe it's an information class, and maybe the real tension or clash is between information and ideas and know-how and experience and action. That may be where there was an aggregation. We downgrade manufacturing in the city, in this country, perhaps some high-techy stuff, even though people can apply all their range of abstract and empirical skills. So I think the real tension is between people who know things intellectually and people who know how to work with other people or to apply ideas, and that's the real challenge to produce prosperity in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big universities, Greenfield universities, that Menzies was responsible for setting up was that this would be a primarily engineering practical university. But within 3 years of it being open, they noticed that 60% of the entrants were doing humanities degrees. So it seems to be that much of the hope was invested in universities in the early 60s that would become these great sort of areas that would teach people technical, more skills that would give us an advance in industry and other fields, and indeed in terms of nation building. Never eventuated, but we ended up with a very large number of humanities. I think I looked, it is more than 50%, I think, in New Zealand who do humanities degrees. And some the law of course is included in that basket of the humanities. Arguably we've got plenty of lawyers. Sorry, I must have shortage on one measure I did actually just for a bit of fun, try and get this, see which areas of Australia were progressive, which was social conservative, to measure the number of lawyers to plumbers, ratio of lawyers to plumbers. And in North Sydney where I live, it's 20 lawyers to every plumber, which accounts for why you can never get a tap washer fixed. But because the more normal one's about 5 plumbers to every lawyer.
They can talk about both.
Hey?
They can talk about getting them protected.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Let me ask a question, and confession, I am a lawyer.
I always insult somebody.
No offence taken. But the gentleman down here at the front touched upon it in his question to you about the nannying aspect, and I haven't read the book on confession, I've read various reviews. But something that intrigues me is why is it the progressive side of politics is frightened of the contest of ideas? And we've seen that in Australia with the recent situation of Stephen Connell with those ghastly media proposals. And they want to effectively stifle, with respect to the Australian newspaper, that's who it was directed at. But also we saw the United Kingdom with the Leadington inquiry, whereby we had Alan Rusbridge, the editor of The Guardian, pleading for the government to pass legislation to impose restrictions upon the journalists. And I just found it to be astonishing because the whole thing is about the contest of ideas, and maybe that's why Kevin Rudd didn't like your book.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. But this is the irony is if I'm correct, and the people that are pushing those ideas now are the heirs or the successors of the group that were leading the great social revolutions of the 60s, then there's a huge irony in that because much of the many of the causes they fought in the 60s were about freedom of expression and the Great Oz trial in the UK and so forth, for the ability to write these. It seems to be a classic case of how you do get a movement or a group that are the outside the barricades at one point, fighting the battle from outside the Bastille, and at some point they actually come to occupy the Bastille, and then they're defending their patch, and it's the defenders who will tend to be, want to shut down debate, and it's the defenders who want to sort of limit debate. But the other thing that's going on, and I cover this in the book, I don't have time to talk about it today, is this very strange sort of convergence of ideas, but come to believe the same thing. Was that great hope people used to talk about, that Kierkegaard sort of idea, you go off on your own individual journey of learning and get your own ideas. That was the sort of, in theory, what my education was supposed to be about when I was at university in the 70s. But the great irony is, of course, everybody comes back believing exactly the same thing. Here's a test. I was thinking about this. I can't remember that I put it in the book, but if you suddenly found yourself in a dinner party in New York amongst educated people, and they were talking about a Republican from Texas, you'd never heard of it. You could probably safely say all sorts of things in conversation and have people before and nodding. You'd say, oh, he's obviously very stupid, and they all laugh at that. So there are these assumptions which almost cross borders. It's almost like IKEA, it's like the furniture of the mind has become like IKEA, absolute. And I've looked at some American political science in there that shows that people have more education, they tend to bunch ideas together. Less educated people just say, well, I believe that, I haven't even got an idea about that, or I think that, But amongst the educated cohort, there's a whole lot of things that go together. So I talk in there, say, if you saw somebody with a bumper sticker on that said, stop the war, you'd be able to say almost immediately, almost everything they thought about every topic. You'd be able to say that they were very concerned about global warming and, wanted to stop coal exports. They wanted, George Bush to face war crimes. They were extremely in favour of gay marriage, why can't we have it now, etc., etc. You go through those things, and you would be right. And it's not just a stereotype. You just know that people believe a set of values or another set of values, and they have their totems now. If somebody reads The Guardian, they're one kind of person. If they read the Daily Telegraph in London, they're another kind of person, and that's become like an international totem. Like people understand what I'm saying there. So it is fascinating. This is almost like a dogma that creeps in. It's not sort of, in my mind, views that people come to through free exploration. It's almost like a brand.
We have time for one final question.
I really liked the way that you contrasted the way that America, Australia, and also Britain developed. And the three concepts, the key concepts that I took from you for Australia were wealth for toil, progress through mechanisation, and mateship. And I'm sure that all of the guys here can probably, they resonate with the guys here. What I've wondered is, are women just a kind of inert precipitate in Australia, America, and England? Or did they also play a role in making Australia?
There was a debate in Australia where John Howard felt we should have something in the preamble of the Constitution which set out in Australia. We have this written, it was very badly written actually. We got the poet Les Murray to help out. And one of the key things was this word mateship. And there was a long debate in Parliament about whether mateship was a blokey term. And I suppose it is. I suppose, look,
I think my question goes beyond the actual relationship, beyond the language. I'd really like to know, because it does seem that women have not played a part in the distinguishing features of the parts of Australia you've described.
well, I do disagree with you on that. I think it's a fact, and we can't get away from it, that Australia and New Zealand were very male societies up until at least the First World War, simply because there were more males. There just were. We looked at this graph the other day. I found a book that that there's the difference between males and females in New Zealand. Starts with many more males than females, and gradually closes up. And what actually brings it to parity is World War I, for rather tragic reasons. So yeah, I think it's true. Inevitably there is a male element, quite a strong male elements in the culture which you can't get away from. But I see too, and I haven't talked about this in the book, but I'd love to explore it further, in the role of women in Australian and New Zealand history. Partly because of the hardship, they were forced to be very stoic and very hard-working, and partly because of the shortage of labour. Women were deeply involved with farming in ways that they wouldn't be in Britain, simply because they had to be. I think those are the things which progressed, for more women's rights much quicker in New Zealand and Australia than elsewhere in the world. You had, of course, you had enfranchisement of women here.
They contribute to egalitarianism, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, I think they fit into that picture. I think they definitely do. And it seems to be the correct, most natural way to think about women in Australian and New Zealand societies is in terms like egalitarianism. Obviously they didn't actually have the full rights of egalitarianism until quite recently, but I'd argue they do now, despite what our former Prime Minister says. That's not to say there isn't individual prejudice that women face every day, but in terms of the institutions, that's
Well, I'm afraid that's what we have time for tonight. I can tell you that we held similar events last night in Auckland and on Monday in Wellington. I think you agree, every night we have different topics that we've covered, which just shows how much there is in this book, and it's a very controversial book. It's triggered lots of debates in Australia, of course, and I just encourage you to read it and buy your copies just outside the auditorium. I think it's worth having this discussion. Our big goal is not to make everybody agree, but just to trigger the discussion, because I think the topics that you cover in the book are vital for democracy and for future progress, the environment, and it's a great project that Australia needs to force. Hopefully it will remain free. So with that, please join me in thanking Nick Kagan.